Perfect. Well, I think it's probably a good time to get started. So hopefully you can see my slideshow there. We should be good to go. My name's AJ Frigo. I'm with the Rural SIG, but also with Purdue University. We'll do some introductions later, so I'll kind of pass it off from there. Just want to remind everyone that you can absolutely use the Q&A feature, the chat feature if you have questions. We have some people behind the scenes and obviously our great panelists here to be able to answer some questions. So we're so thrilled that you can join us today for Rural Student Recruitment Best Practices. This was a presentation that I was able to give at NACAC for Indiana, and it went really well. And so we had some great people volunteer, and Mary and Jay to join us and present on this topic. So just a quick breakdown of the agenda, what we're going to go over. Welcome and introductions. We're going to cover why we should recruit rural. That's a really important piece of what's going on. Why rural? Obviously, you're all here to learn that. Important data and information you may need to know, but we tried to not make this a very data heavy presentation. We'd rather give you actual actionable steps to take to move forward. And so that's really the meat of this presentation. We're going to cover challenges on what it's like to recruit a rural student. And those of you that are here probably know exactly what those challenges are firsthand. That's likely why you're in this webinar. We're going to talk about some prep work that you can do as an office, and then some recruitment tips. And I think one of the most valuable pieces of this presentation is that rural is not always created equally. And so it's really beneficial that we had panelists from different regions of the US to kind of cover those areas. So it'll be really, really exciting. So we'll talk about the Midwest, the South, and the East Coast, and then obviously some Q&A. This presentation may be 30, 35 minutes, and then there's going to be plenty of time for questions. We can share contact information if you have them. And then one thing we wanted to start with was actually a quick poll. And so we want to know who you are and where you're attending from. So we'll get those polls out to you as soon as possible, and just let us know who you are and where you're coming from. We're really looking forward to hearing about it. Okay, one last piece as those polls are coming out is navigating Zoom. Obviously, you can chat to engage with panelists. This obviously isn't your first Zoom rodeo, but there's a Q&A feature that you can get involved with. Please ask us questions. We'd be happy to cover them. We're not going to read everything on every slide. So if there's something that stands out to you and you want to know more and we don't cover that, please feel free to ask about it in the Q&A. We'd love to elaborate more. And you're not on video and you're always muted. And of course, this session is being recorded. So please feel free to be involved in those things later on. So you got your polls coming out right now. What is your professional role? We're going to see those coming through. And then we'll touch on after that where you're coming from. So we'll get started with that. So we are now on to the introducing our speakers. So if you want to take things over, Jay, and kind of start with an introduction of who you are and what you do and why you're here presenting.
Awesome. My name is Jay Johnson. I am an expert planner at College Prep U, where we help students navigate the college admission process here in the great city of Birmingham in the state of Alabama. So roll tide. Most importantly, I'm just really excited to be here to kind of help out with the rural side, because recruiting rural students is something that very heavily passionate about, but we've worked with so many of them. So I'm really happy to be on this panel and giving some insight and to learn.
Wow, it looks like we have great representation across the Mid-Atlantic, Midwest, Mountain States, Southeast. Great to have all of you here. My name is Mary Smith. I am one of the Senior Associate Directors of Admissions at Gettysburg College. A former hat of mine, it was the president of PACAC, which is our Pennsylvania Association for College Admissions Counseling. And I've been involved over the years on and off with the Rural SIG, but it is very much near and dear to my heart, as believe it or not, I grew up in rural northern New Jersey, which most people don't think New Jersey and think rural, but there are those pockets. It is called the Garden State for a reason. But I am very much involved in our rural communities in Pennsylvania. I actually recruit the majority of my territory for Gettysburg College is in rural Pennsylvania. So this is definitely a presentation and an area that's near and dear to my heart as well. And I'm excited to connect with our wonderful panelists.
Perfect. And my name is AJ Frigo. I'm actually on the Rural SIG leadership team, and I have been for I think 2 years now. So it's been really great meeting with some amazing people you've probably seen on previous webinars. But my full-time job is being the director of recruitment at the Daniel School of Business at Purdue University. Sorry for the mouthful. We just had a name change, so it's we have to say it every time. So with all that being said, Previous to this, I worked in undergraduate admissions at Purdue University, and my job was the senior assistant director in charge of Indiana relations. So that's where we really started to take off with rural. Prior to all of that, I went to a rural college with 120 people in my graduating class. And then prior to all of that, I grew up in Cornfield, Indiana. It's not the name of the city, but it should have been. 55 kids in my high school graduating class from the nearest 3 cities in Indiana. So rurality is something I didn't even know existed until I got into higher education. I thought everyone grew up in a cornfield and everyone did these types of things. So I've always been really passionate about helping rural kids find out about college access. But as you all know, you don't have to be from a cornfield or from rural Pennsylvania or rural Birmingham, Alabama to be an advocate for these students and to realize their importance and value into this. So with all that being said, we got where are people joining from? We have that. And let's move on to the next one. I think we have another poll coming at you. But let's jump over and we're going to have Mary kind of talk about why we should recruit rural, like what that looks like as an enrollment office.
Sure. So I think that's the big question. Why are we all here? Why is it important to recruit in rural areas and rural students? I think as I was looking over in preparation for this session, I was surprised yet not surprised to see the majority of land mass across the United States is considered rural. And yet, when you look at percentages and populations of where we all are drawing our students from, it's much more the urban and the suburban. But if you look at where there's growth, it's in the rural area. So I think we all have enrollment goals we need to meet. 29% of 18 to 24-year-olds in college are in rural settings. So it's important for us. This is a demographic that is on a little bit of the uptick. So that's an important piece for us. We know it's important for financial mobility and the health of our communities to have students from all experiences, all geographic backgrounds, to have that post-bac degree. So this is something we need to be thinking about, whether it's because of our jobs and the nature of our work, and frankly, we need to meet those goals, and our own home communities. Gettysburg College is set kind of in what I consider small town, but yet outside the big cities. If you look at our area, the larger area around Gettysburg where I am, it is very rural. Going to the north of us, we're surrounded by apple orchards. We have a very large percentage of students there's a lot of uncertainty, and their experience with access is very limited because they haven't gotten that exposure. So it's important for our own communities, for the health of our communities, to recruit rural students. And rural students want it. I think we all know this, working with students across the country. They want to attend college. The data is out there that students from rural communities want and expect to attend college at very similar rates to their urban and suburban peers. But here's the caveat. Many of them, junior, senior year, it starts to fade off a little bit. And the expectations, whether that be home related, whether it be school related, whether it be peer pressure related, something happens. And that percentage that initially apply to colleges then it drops in those who actually go to college. So we really need to increase those opportunities for students. But again, it's a pocket, it's an opportunity for all of us to fill our colleges and universities. And then the diversity, equity, and inclusion piece. This is huge. There seems to be an assumption. We put the data in there that there's an assumption that all students coming from rural areas are white. And I can tell you and speak from experience, that is definitely not the case. So when we're looking at our DEI goals as well as institutions, again, right in my own background, or my own backyard, I should say, we have a very high Latinx population in the Gettysburg area for a variety of different reasons. And a lot of the different places I recruit across Pennsylvania have different pockets of where students are coming from, some from immigrant families, some from just different areas, but that perception versus reality is a bit different. So I think it's important to consider that it's not all what we think in our mind's eye and stereotypes. We really need to think more broadly and how those opportunities can then shape our campus communities.
Perfect. Okay, I'm going to cover some of the data just really briefly. And again, you'll have access to all these slides. So I just want you to be aware that this is not the meat of the presentation. So we're going to cover just some quick pieces. Everyone's really scared about the demographic cliff, right? It's coming, or is it? Nobody really knows at this point in time. The assumption is it's coming, right? But with all that being said, The interesting thing is one of the newest reports, this actually came out in February 2023, shows that they're actually expecting rural America to grow, whereas the suburban and urban peers are going to decrease significantly. So this might be a pipeline type issue. Your institution needs to really be thinking about more than just next recruitment cycle. It needs to be thinking about 20 years down the road recruitment cycle, right? With this demographic cliff, they're projecting what 25% of all colleges closing in the next 10, 15 years. That's a really scary thing. And so understanding this is really important. And this may also be a really important piece you can take to your supervisors or stakeholders that maybe are less interested in advocating for rural students by saying, hey, this is projections. We're going to need to, get involved in this kind of recruiting process early. We know they have interest in coming to schools at an early age, and we know the population's there. Let's start recruiting them. Another thing, just in case, depending on what college you're coming from or visiting from right now, public 4-year is the most common where rural students are enrolling in the United States. Public 2-year is not far behind though. So a really important thing we'll talk about is articulation agreements or pathway programs for these students. Rural students more often than their peers undermatch themselves. So they traditionally say, oh, I don't think I can do it. I can't make it at a Purdue University. I'm going to go to a community college, which there's nothing wrong with community colleges, but if these students have the resources and the access to be successful in those schools, there's no reason they couldn't be. So sometimes they just need that extra boost from us as higher education employees. Private, nonprofit, and then obviously for-profit, there where students break down from rural. All right, so we talk about the demographic cliff, right? And this is just a projection, so who knows, we're looking at it. But Northeast and Midwest, that looks like where we're going to be losing students, but it looks like the South and the West, we're going to be increasing. And so that's a really important piece, as well as Jay talks about his experiences recruiting in the South. Those population numbers are going to increase. And so we need to be aware of that as we're looking at targeted enrollment pockets. And then another thing to keep in mind is that just obviously where students are coming from, students in rural Indiana, but rural anywhere, are still graduating high school, right? There's still a large chunk of them that are doing it. And so that's another key piece. Another, misconception may be that rural students aren't graduating high school or going from there. They are, and they're absolutely ready to go from there. So let's start looking for these students as we work our way through this process. The final thing, and this may be a point where you kind of point at the map and decide, oh, this is my territory, or this is where I'm at. This is what that looks like. So those non-metro low education counties, the orange ones, those are the pieces we really want to be looking at. Those are very rural areas with low education, and that's going to be really, really hard when you're recruiting in those areas to convince those families, not just the student, but the family, to enroll in a higher education institution. And so it's really a whole entire culture shift you're going to have to manage, and that's obviously not easy. So as we're getting into the things are not going to be easy, I think that's a perfect segue to talk about, what's challenging when you're recruiting rural. And I think we could spend an hour just talking about this, but we're going to have Jay kind of touch on some of the big challenges he sees, and then Mary and I may chime in with some other pieces.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I honestly, like when I think about the challenges in recruiting in rural areas, it's so many of them, as you can see, and it's more than just this, but some of the first ones that come to my mind is, well, a couple things. One, when they're in a rural area, they probably have lack of access to quality teachers. Majority of the teachers that, who were there that were really passionate about driving students are retiring, have retired. And so now they're being replaced almost by, Teach for America. Now, there's nothing wrong about Teach for America and the cohorts that they bring through, but some of these individuals are not teachers in this on-the-job training, and then also not having access to just good counselors. Because it's so limited in small areas that it's not a very attractive job. There are a lot of people who would probably be qualified enough to go down there and work, just don't have the desire to live in those rural communities. Of course, you got the first generation challenges, where you just don't know what you don't know. But from the institutional side, it's really just lack of visibility. It's hard to look at rural communities and consistently plan to get down there to get in front of the students to say, hey, we want to build this strong pipeline from this very small, low income area, especially here in the South. And because we have an abundance of HBCUs down here, it kind of makes it easy, but then it's only on the stronghold by state. So most importantly, I think that the biggest component that we look at when some of the challenges is just, lack of teachers, lack of counselors, and just lack of knowledge and visibility.
Perfect. And then I'm going to touch on a couple of things that I think are really important. And Mary, if you have any other, feel free. But I think two of the biggest ones for us is that it's very hard to define rural. and this might be the hardest part that you all end up having when you're talking with stakeholders in your offices about creating a rural recruitment team. There's no one definition. And so in Indiana alone, when I did this presentation, Indiana had 9 different rural territories, 9 different maps that all had different counties and towns and cities in rural areas, and very few times were there actual overlap in what rural looks like. I know for a fact rural Indiana in cornfields and soybean fields is going to look a lot different than New Mexico on a Native American reservation in rural, and in the South in rural, right? There's loads of things that this may look like, and even New Jersey rural, right? I didn't honestly know there was a New Jersey rural, and Mary informed me that earlier in this presentation. So a big thing is it's really hard to define rural, and that might be a tricky part for your office, but that doesn't mean that we stop there. There's definitely resources, and there's definitely people you can reach out to kind of say, what do you define rural as, and how do I find those pockets of individuals? And I think most students don't define themselves as rural. They don't realize they are rural students. They don't realize that they're different or other than students. And so that's a really key piece. The final thing I always like to touch on is a really interesting article related to the top rural students. So the top students throughout all of the United States that are rural have the most difficult time in choosing what they're going to do post-college, because they have the knowledge base and the scores and the resources to get into some top schools. But they also have the societal pressures of their hometown to stay and to uplift that community. And so these students are really, really, really torn. So that's a huge challenge. So even when you do find very well qualified, very strong academic students, they also have to deal with, do I go to a local school and appease my family? Do I not go to school at all and appease my community? Or do I travel really far away and feel selfish about that decision? And so that's a really tricky part when you're recruiting these students, at least the very top rural students. And then Mary, anything else you wanted to chime in before we jump over?
Well, I think going back to, the assumptions is one of the assumptions is that everyone's also speaking the same language. I mean, one of our biggest challenges is we need a lot of information in Spanish, for example, for our parents who are trying to help their students, but really they're so uncertain because many are first generation, many have not had their own experiences with college going. And of course, as Jay touched on, that financial limitations, all of those pieces. So I think going back to, really understanding and knowing your rural areas. I mean, I was intrigued when I was looking at the data. Maine and Vermont have some of the highest rural, percentage-wise, some of the highest rural populations. Actually, they're number 1 and number 2. Who would have thought Maine and Vermont? and again, thinking of that as rural, but I think it's really understanding and identifying the challenges in your particular rural territory. And then really working with the families, understanding what the families' challenges and needs are, not just their students, because it all winds together.
And if you don't mind if I can chime in real fast, I also, a while back, we had, especially during COVID, one thing we realized about the rural communities is really just the use of technology. A lot of them may not have the technology infrastructure, but, you take a student in the rural community, you take a student in the suburban community and an urban community, and the way they use technology is completely different. They can be the same age and they can go to the same platforms, but they use it completely different. And so when recruiters typically go out to recruit students, and the way you may use technology for a QR code or different ways to connect with the student may work across the board if you're in the urban or suburban communities. But when you get into the rural communities, as you define rural, especially here in the South, it may not work the same, and that goes from a student to a parent to even, at the high school level, the way they may use it or their knowledge of it may not be the same as well. So that's something also definitely that becomes a challenge.
Perfect. So I just want to, before we get on to what we can do to fix all these problems, which is, we'll kind of cover that. I had a couple of Q&A questions. And so let's kind of go over those just really briefly. I'll start, and then obviously Mary and Jay, feel free to chime in if anything else additional. One of the questions is, do we know why rural student FAFSA filing fell 18% in 2022? And do we expect it to go down further? Predicting what 17-year-olds are going to do is always nearly impossible. If you tell any director of admissions or recruitment, they'll tell you that for sure, right? So do we know why it went down? My assumption is, and some of the research has obviously been COVID blowbacks. It's been a really big piece of that. So lack of technology, lack of infrastructure in the area, lack of resources. And then of course, the most overburdened school counselors are normally going to be in the most underserved areas. And whether that's inner city or rural areas, they're still underserved. And so a lack of resources is a big piece of that. The other really big phenomenon, at least we're seeing in Indiana, that may be similar in other areas, is we're finding that students are being offered jobs right out of high school in factory work or even in fast food service or Walmart. And because of the increases in wages, we're finding that students are actually being able to make more money than their parents ever made. And so, when Arby's or McDonald's is hiring for $17.50 an hour, it's not the case always in Indiana, but I think it's $14 or $15 an hour. That's more money than some of these rural parents have ever made their entire lives. And so it's really hard for a student to assume, oh, I should just take on more debt. Let me fill out a FAFSA, let me take out more debt and enroll in college when I could be making more money tomorrow than my parents have ever made per hour. And so it's a really interesting thing we're seeing with the principals across Indiana saying we can't even encourage students to go to college because they're not seeing a benefit to it. So that's a really tricky thing that we have to deal with because our Indiana population just fell to 53% college going rate, which has dropped 14% in the last 4 years. So it's not good. And so that might be one piece of it, but does anybody else have anything they want to touch on why rural FAFSA fell?
I'll add the related question in the chat with the changes to the FAFSA upcoming. Do we expect the number to continue going down? And unfortunately, I'd love to say, no, it's going to go the other direction because it's going to be simplified and easier. And I'd love to say that was the goal. That was the point. Sure. But I think the reality is I was doing a presentation just a couple of weeks ago in a public school setting, local, rural area. And I said, yes. And with the FAFSA changes, and the counselors looked at me and they said, the FAFSA is changing. And so if our own individuals who are counseling and working with our students aren't getting a lot of that information because they're handling 10 million other things. I was just talking with another counselor down the road trying to tie up the year. In Pennsylvania this year, we have something called Act 158, where they have new accountability that counselors are responsible for, that they have to report out before the year closes in order for every student to graduate. It's just coupling all the responsibilities that our counselors have to do. And so will the changes to the FAFSA, do we think that's going to continue to decline? Positively, I'd like to say, sure, the simplification will be helpful, but the reality is I'm not so sure. I do have faith that we will get good guidance when it comes out. I'd like to hope for that, but it's hard to know.
And I can say one thing here is, I'm just going to say one word is ignorance. The number is going to steadily decline because one, a parent don't truly understand how financial aid works. That parent might not have even filed their taxes, and they're afraid that if they give that information to someone else to look at or let someone else know they didn't, that there will be some ramifications behind it. Secondly, you have just some illegal practices where, families will allow other individuals to claim their kids and essentially just sell their social security number for pay, for money, and not know the effects of how that's going to hurt their kid when their child is trying to apply for financial aid and they have to go to some other person to get them to become their guardian in a sense. And then lastly, it's just that they just don't do it. At the end of the day, we help so many students with their financial aid, and it's just as simple as the parent says, no, I'm just not going to do it at all. I'm just not going to do it. And and here in Alabama, it's mandated by the governor that every student file their financial aid. It doesn't matter what your economic status is, you must file your financial aid. But if you don't, then they'll give you a waiver. So it's I'm gonna tell you to do something, and then I'm gonna say, but you don't have to. And so that alone becomes very confusing when you got to deal with the financial aid component, and then you got state legislation that come in and play as well on top of, just trying to understand how to get this information to colleges.
Yeah, perfect. We're going to jump on now. We're in the doom and gloom, right? Everything's not great, but we still have resources to be successful in these areas. And I was going to touch on the same thing. We advocated really heavily for our ENAC Act to get more FAFSA help. Unfortunately, what was passed is it's now mandated that everyone has to fill out a FAFSA, which we hope will increase college enrollment. But at the same time, they put all that pressure on the school counselor, which makes it even harder. And then just as Jay talked about, our thing is that now in Indiana, if they don't want to do it, they can just get a waiver. And so are they actually mandating it or not? We'll kind of see from there. So that may be a piece of advocacy you can work on. So we're going to touch on some prep work as an office. Mary's going to cover that, and then we'll get into how we can actually solve these problems, which is the whole group of this presentation.
So, and I won't go deep into this because many of you are admissions officers and you know the prep work that goes into your travel planning, your territory management, your own recruitment. Here are some wonderful opportunities to think about. I oversee travel in our office and really thinking about where do we need to be going strategically, the best use of our time. And I recognize that there are challenges with that as well. But I think with rural, you especially want to be thinking about the second bullet point, club support services, sometimes even churches. I work with a group called the College Advising Corps, our College Advising Corps of Pennsylvania. There are a wonderful wealth of resource, of information. And frankly, they are my targets in rural communities in terms of the schools I'm going to be visiting, because they have developed relationships with their students and their family members and their community members. And so I'm able to tie in. And the ability to then, maybe I'm doing school visits that are in a nearby more urban or suburban setting. And then maybe that evening I'm doing a program with one of those community-based organizations. I think that's a huge piece for us, is really targeting that. So when you're thinking about your territory management, your travel, and how you're going to put all of these pieces together, look at the data, look at your institutional data, look at the IPEDS data, look at EPS data, enrollment planning services. You're looking at ACT data, College Board data, all of those different things to make your decisions in terms of where do I recruit? How do I best find these students? And then look at it from the context of, well, what has our office been doing well at? That low-hanging fruit. What have you already been doing? What have people before you been doing? And move on from there. And frankly, use your own students. They're a wonderful resource. There's a school I go to in Mercersburg, which is not too far from Gettysburg, about 45 minutes to an hour. And we have a teacher who was a part of, who worked with a college advisor, who went through the process themselves, came to Gettysburg, now is back at their school. They're a wonderful alum connection. But then we have several current students who are now at Gettysburg, who I work with and ask them questions. And they will be brutally honest to say, you need to do this and don't do this. So also use your resources at your own fingertips and get to know your community, your own college community, in the sense of, okay, if I'm going here, who are my kids that I need to be focused on, and what are their connections as well?
Perfect. Okay, we do have a couple questions in the chat. If you have more, feel free. We're now going to start answering some of those questions as it relates to what we can do. So I know one of them is specifically about hesitancy to kind of come to campus. I think that's probably a whole separate topic. So let's cover that one like towards the end if we want, because that one's a longer piece, and we do have some resources at the rural SIG as well. And then the other question was, how did we bridge the gap between extra touch points needed by first-gen students and other prospective students? I think we might cover some of that stuff here on this next slide. So best practices. So we'll kind of start getting into this. We're all three going to kind of cover certain pieces that we have found most fruitful, and then maybe touch on things from the South, Midwest, or East Coast that maybe make more sense for them. My biggest thing with Indiana specifically, which is mainly where I recruit rural, is that my students, more often than not, let's say 95% of the time, care about three things: faith, family, and career. And it's a really interesting thing versus when I visit in different areas of the country, and I've recruited internationally for Purdue. I've done a lot of things. Some people, the very first thing they want to know is, how safe is your campus? Some people, the very first thing is, how good does the food taste? The other one is, how good is your football team, right? And that all kind of changes depending on where you're at. But when I recruit rural, when you finally get them to open up, they're not just going to deliver this information right off the bat, but when you build relationships, they finally end up saying, what are your religious affiliations on campus? Normally in Indiana, it's, where's your Methodist church? Do you have one? And that's a really important piece for us. And then their family needs to be involved. Their family needs to be heavily involved and almost make the decision for them. The family needs to okay it, say yes, and then make sure that they trust the person that's telling them all this information. That's a huge piece for us, is trust. And then finally, career. When I grew up in Cornfield, Indiana, my high school told me there were two jobs in the world. I could be a teacher or I could be a doctor. Those were my two things. That was it. Those were the only classes that were offered in my area. Had I known one day I'd be a recruiter, that would have blew my mind that that's an even thing that you could do. And so you need to help them understand what a career looks like. how much money you can make during certain things. And my big pitch now, Purdue agriculture is one of the best in the world. When I recruit in rural areas, I say, hey, do you know we have the 4th best turf science program in the country? And they're always like, turf science, that's not a real thing. You can't do that. I was like, no, our most recent graduate runs Lambeau Field for the Green Bay Packers. That puts it into perspective for them, right? They understand how that process works. And then you throw in data. The average starting salary is $55,000 a year. That's more money than their parents have ever made. That's such a big connection piece. So it takes, I don't want to call it hand-holding, but it's more information given to these individuals, and you need to have them follow up. And a lot of the times you need to follow up with them before they follow up with you, right? Giving your email is not one, most people know this, giving your card's not going to work. Get their contact information and build a relationship that way rather than putting them all on them to reach out to you. So faith, family, and career. And the second piece I wanted to cover is consistent effort. I can't tell you how many times I've worked with peers, even in my own school and then across the country, where they say, well, I visited the rural school and then nobody showed up, so I'm not going back. You know, it wasn't a good use of my time. That's not the way you're going to recruit these students, right? It's consistent effort. Building trust in any impoverished or neighborhood is going to be really, really difficult, or under-resourced neighborhood is very difficult. So you have to go back. At Purdue, we have a policy where we visit every single high school in Indiana once a year. It has to be done, every single high school. And I can't tell you the number of lunch visits I sat through where I didn't talk to a soul, or it was really uncomfortable. But my motto moving forward was, if you can just talk to one, you made a difference. And that's the mindset you have to have when you're recruiting rural. So those are my pieces: faith, family, and career, and then consistent effort, right? It's not like, oh, this didn't work out last year, so we're not going back. Continue to go back, continue to advocate for your school and help these students. And then I'll turn it over to Mary and Jay to give 2 of their ideas.
So I'll continue to talk about the CBOs and the importance of community-based organizations. We think about CBOs in a lot of ways in urban and suburban settings, but they are very much in the rural settings as well. Frankly, it's just a matter of finding them. And sometimes they're tied into a community service organization. Sometimes they're tied into a college. Sometimes they're tied into a church, but they're there, and it's a matter of understanding and finding them. Our college advising corps connections in Pennsylvania, they're tied into over 30 different schools in rural communities. And frankly, it's a back and forth. I mean, going off of what AJ just said about the consistency and the returning, it's about doing essay workshops. It's about doing financial aid presentations. It's about doing college application days. We do a lot of college application days at their individual high schools because, as somebody mentioned in the Q&A, it's hard for them to travel. And sometimes that even 1 hour drive can be challenging because they have to take off work, their parent has to take off work, they have to get there, and they may not be comfortable with all of the above. The more you can work with your partners, I work with a lot of our partners who are part of the College Access Program, who then they will organize the class trip. And frankly, we're then able to say, okay, we'll provide the meals, we'll provide the people. If the school can get them here, we will do everything else. And sometimes it's a matter of us helping the school with that transportation cost. And it's targeting those places where we have those relationships and knowing you're not going to be able to travel every school to your school. But even if you start out with 2 or 3, and then next spring you do 2 or 3 from those rural communities, it is amazing to me. Year after year, I think we know in admissions recruitment, it is all about building relationships. It is all about making connections, whether that's urban, suburban, or rural. But frankly, I think it's even more important in rural areas because they get to know each other. They know who graduated last year and is at your school. They know what they're doing at your school. They've been following their Instagram. They will tell you what your own students are doing. So those connections, those relationships are everything, because when you visit that school next year, they're going to say, how's Johnny doing? And what's he been up to? And that teacher is going to come find you, that was Johnny's favorite music teacher. And they're going to talk to you about what he's been up to. So those relationships are key. The returning and doing what I call more service related opportunities. And don't forget, you can do these things over Zoom now. I will say that the one positive and not so positive coming out of COVID is the Zoom opportunities. And I've done quite a few of those with our rural schools who I can't always get, the 4 hours of Northern Pittsburgh, it's just not possible, but we can connect online and then they record them and send them out to their students. So there are also other ways to be thinking about.
Excellent. So for me, one of the few ways that I feel like has been truly effective. One, some institutions have the ability to formulate what they call a high school advisory board. I sit on a couple of them, one being like University of Alabama. I also sit on Alabama A&M. I also sit on my alma mater, which is Morehouse College. And so what that does is, they would bring some of those leadership and our influential individuals in the community out to them to teach them about what's going on with the institution. They will actually give them the ability to kind of like help make decisions, help mold, some of the requirements, or just let them know what some of the new admission practices are. And they'll go back into their community and have that discussion. And the cool thing about it is, like, one of the boards, they actually invite these individuals actually show up are some of the superintendents, or even some of the small rural town mayors. Like, they have a mayor that will come and sit in this room with us and talk about the admission practices. And what's even funnier is that, of course, we're like, okay, that's a mayor, that's pretty cool, you're a civil servant. But man, that mayor is so happy to be involved with that college that they're singing more praises about the institutions, and not just that one institution, but just all the institutions that have contacted their office. And so, like, I think a kind of a cool way, especially, like for the directors that are on here, or the VP of enrollment management, speak to leadership go a long way. So I think, like, instead of always trying to go through the counselors or trying to find time to talk to the principal, reach out to the superintendent, reach out to a school board member, reach out to, a civil servant, a mayor, whomever, and have a conversation. It's like, look, we want to bring more of your students here. What can we do? And they will foster those relationships for you. They'll make those connections for you. So you no longer have to worry about building the bridge. It's laid out. All you got to do is just continuously go. And then I can also suggest to leadership, if there's a change in your office of admissions, like if you had a recruiter that recruited a certain area for, let's say, 1 or 2 cycles, and they're no longer there, it's your civic responsibility to contact them directly as leadership and say, hey, I just want to let you know that we have a change. We're bringing in a new recruiter in this area. And so we're really excited about this person, because that warm transition keeps that pipeline open, opposed to making it cold and that person have to rebuild the trust in that area. So those are some of the those are some of the best practices that I've seen that work and that we've suggested. And another one would be, just fireside chats on the on Zoom or in person, or whatever you can do to kind of just give yourself more visibility. That's really about it.
Jay, I love your point about superintendents. I'm also thinking, so definitely the top of the food chain, if you will, but also don't discount those wonderful receptionists who, frankly, I build more connections with the secretaries, the guidance office, who they're the ones scheduling the visits, because oftentimes they don't have Naviance, they don't have SCORE, they don't have all of these other tools. It's the main guidance office receptionist who's the one who's in charge of all of that. And who do the students see when they walk in there? And frankly, one of you had said, what strategies do you suggest for working with high school counselors that are overworked and maybe missing important information? Anytime I send emails to a school counselor I've been working with, I copy the receptionist, whoever that point person is. And oftentimes she or he is getting it in that right direction. So using those other resources. I also do a lot of, hey, let me help you. It's not just me, let me talk to you about Gettysburg, but hey, let me help you. Here's an essay workshop that I pre-recorded. Here is a mock interview workshop that I pre-recorded, and I'll send them out one at a time. I worked with our Conservatory of Music, and we did an audition prep right before COVID. And I sent that out to counselors and said, hey, here's a help in terms of your students going through the audition process. That had one of the highest opening rates from our rural communities. So I think it's also, what are those service opportunities for very, very busy counselors who still need to meet their students where they are and still need to give them all of those tools and resources. If we can help with that, chances are then they'll come back to you. And it is very cyclical. I do see and have found that reward, if you will, that the counselors that will then reach out to me and say, hey, I've got a student. Can you talk to them?
Yeah, that's perfect. And actually, I was going to answer that too. We'll probably get into the Q&A now. Like, there's definitely some questions in here. If you have more about any of these strategies, feel free to mention it. But definitely chatting about the thing, what strategies can we do to help with rural counselors or any of these overwhelmed counselors? The most effective thing I did is every time I visited a high school, like I came back, I brought application data from the year prior. So I'd physically hand them a sheet that said, oh, at Purdue University, you had 6 applications, 5 of them got in, that's crazy. And 4 of them matriculated and they're doing so well at Purdue. And that was such a big thing. So then they didn't have to think about it. They already knew where their students were going. The same exact thing with providing resources, like helping them fill out a college report or a school report for the common application. These counselors are really underserved. You may just say, hey, I've read a lot of applications in my time. I noticed you don't have a school report. We'd be happy to help. And there's free resources even in our SIG to help them create a school report. That's a great resource as well. Keeping them updated with like newsletters or things going on, you can add them to your listservs. I know not everyone loves emails, but it's important to at least have access to it. And then involvement in community events is a really big piece as well. You don't have to only go to their college fair night. Most of them won't even host one. Instead, go to their local chapter of blank or sponsor their table at the local school play. These are all options that you can do for relatively cheap and still build relationships in certain areas. A big one we started this year is looking with rural areas and finding they need judges for FFA competitions or BPA or FBLA or DECA. Fill in the blank, Student Council, National Honor Society. There are thousands of clubs, even sporting events. If you show up to those or say, hey, oh, by the way, I know you need 2 judges. I'd be happy to get you 2 faculty members that can do this. Or if you don't have access to that, I have students that can do it. Or even I can come in and judge a mock pitch competition. That gives them such a weight lifted and it automatically builds trust. So those are some key pieces I found in helping with these really busy school counselors that might actually help get things moving. Okay, anybody else? And then otherwise we'll jump to another question.
I love the question, and I feel like this could be applicable for all areas, but how do we get to the point with students where they're comfortable enough to open up and trust you? Easier said than done, right? I will borrow an example from a good friend of mine who's at one of our state schools in Pennsylvania. And he does, at the beginning of the year, anybody who's in his system, he sends out a text to all the students with his electronic business card and says, hey, would love to stay connected with you. Download this and we'll chat. And so periodically then he'll send a text. What's your favorite ice cream? Hey, this is going on at my school, you know, in case you're interested. And it's very much, again, relationship driven, but we know students are on their social media, they're texting. They don't want to really talk to us necessarily until they've talked to us over the electronics. So if you can start that off, that personal relationship, even before you're on their campus, before you're visiting their high school. Talking with him afterwards, I was so impressed by how many students then come to his visits because he's already connected with them over text. And usually it's about the littlest, sometimes the silliest thing. Is it pumpkins or apples in the fall? Is it this or is it this? Some sort of simple thing that starts a conversation that's not intimidating so that when he shows up, they've already been connecting with him and he's a nice person. So I think it's sometimes building those connections before you even get to campus over the resources you have, the text, the social media, et cetera.
And I can also chime into that as well. I think just being authentic, like that's the big thing. Just be your most authentic self. Like I can only tell you, like when I was a director of admissions and I remember I'm hitting the trail and I would have counselors that, you know, we had a fair and the counselor wouldn't even stand up behind the table. Like they would just sit down and the students would come to the table and they just stay seated. And, you know, for me, I'm on the outside, I'm on the other side of the table. Like that table is a barrier to me. And so like, you know, I'm gonna talk to them and I'm gonna tell them, look, hey, this might not be the opportunity for you because we don't offer engineering here, but I know this school right here does. And I even know their qualifications. Let me introduce you to the admission counselor. And I would do a warm transfer to that admission counselor. We all understand that, you know, we all have a job, you know, it's like butts and seats and I get it, but sometimes you have to be okay with like creating that trust by giving a potential sale to someone else where you know they're going to be more successful at. And I think when that student sees that you're very authentic to the point where you're saying, hey, we don't offer this, but I know someone that else does, and let me go ahead and refer you to them, they'll be more inclined to say, you know what, that guy over there is really cool. My friend is actually looking at this and I think you guys have it. And that trust goes a long way, but most importantly, you never know who's watching. Teachers may see it, counselors may see it, administration may see it. So now you're building a reputation in this community as a very authentic person. and then a recruiter for an institution. And that goes a long way when you're trying to at least get people comfortable enough to at least open up to you and trust you. And really, it's just like, what do you want them to do? Like, what do you want them to open up to you about? Is it, what they're looking to pursue, or if they just want to come to your institution? So that's just me.
Yeah, what Jay said, I think, was probably the most important piece of all this with building trust is you have to be authentic, and you have to be okay with saying, yeah, we don't actually have that, or no, I don't actually know the answer to this, but I can get it for you, and I will get it for you. And that's a really important piece. So since he covered that so eloquently, I'll skip over that. My two pieces for building trust are going to be market segmentation and then bringing students with you. And so what that looks like for us is we actually segmented, and we have a pretty sophisticated marketing team, so not everyone's able to do this. So I'm pretty lucky at Purdue. We were able to basically separate by, if you're from this zip code, if you're a woman doing this specific type of thing, we did 15 different videos, all with different segmentations, and sent those students individualized postcards with an actual student's name. And this person was just like them, right? They had something just like them. And that was a really strong piece for us because it found a way for them to be excited about the process. We can do that with drip campaigns, with our marketing campaigns, with our emails that are specific to what they need and who they are. And that's a really important thing you can talk with your marketing people about. And then from a recruitment standpoint, the most effective thing I do is I have student ambassadors. It's without a doubt. I'll talk with a family for an hour straight, spitting off every fact about Purdue you've ever heard in your entire life. And kids are excited and families like it. And then the student comes over, the current student, and they'll say, hey, tell me about you and tell me about this. Or the prospective student will say, do you like Purdue? And if the kid says yes, they care about that more than anything I said. It doesn't matter. So really engage students, current students, in what you're doing. And I think you're going to be so much more fruitful and engaging in building trust.
And I also think that, I'm sorry, Mary, go ahead. I apologize. Okay.
Ahead, Jay.
I also think that goes into even the other question about bridging that gap between extra touch points needed for first-gen students and other prospective students. I think that, if you truly understand and address the concern, which for a first-gen student is going to be, of course, financial, and it's going to also be, just a security, just feeling secure on campus. I think that if you can say, hey, we have these type of programs. Here's students that, who also were first gen and their success. And like what you said, AJ, having those students readily available to connect with them. If the student come on campus and you've identified that these students that come on campus are first gen, have other first gen there to greet them. And then also as a personal touch, I used to have my first gen students write notes to the students they had conversations with. So now they're getting a handwritten letter from someone they just had a conversation with access to these students as well, and they follow them on social media right then and there. And so I think that, to get the extra touch points, address the concern, I think get others involved, and then most importantly, understand what resources you have on campus for these students, so that way they feel more welcome when they come in.
Two other things I would add that are specifically to your own institution, and that's, host a college fair. If you're in a rural area yourself, host an event, have something. We use our spring break to bring in a lot of the local high schools who are considered to be rural areas to do different events and different workshops, and we host their teachers. So teachers are now talking about Gettysburg, their students are now talking about Gettysburg, and they're getting valuable resources. The other thing is really understanding that dual enrollment piece in terms of whether it's advanced placement courses, community college credits, what is it and how does it transfer? Because I do especially find in our Pennsylvania schools that dual enrollment, those 3-2 programs, all of those different things are really important because they're hearing from their counselors, hey, it's cheaper if you do it now versus wait for college. So one of the big questions I get asked when I visit my rural schools is, how do you accept those credits? Do you have a cooperating agreement? What's the connection? How will this transfer? So making sure you have an understanding of how their credits will transfer and how that will help them, and help them to know that opportunity is there for them and that we value that.
Perfect. All right. So I know we're mostly wrapping up at this point in time. If you have any last second questions, feel free to throw them in, but I want to answer the big one we had, which was, about transportation, right? Students, they want to bus in students that are rural and they want to get them to campus, but students are hesitant to ride the bus. And have you had any advice on how to tackle that experience? So I'll cover one or two things really briefly. And then if anybody else has experience, feel free to kind of jump in. You're absolutely correct. Purdue has the resources to bus people in, and we traditionally have a hard time getting people to do it. There's so many permission slips and compliances and data pieces and safety pieces that need to be filled out. It's just so many barriers on top of barriers for the students that don't need barriers. It's the most complicated process. And so a couple things I would advise. One, if you have regional recruiters or relationships built with any of these high schools, utilize them to say, hey, well, maybe I can't do 10 different local high schools. Let's just get 5 kids from one high school. And then if they go with a peer or a school counselor, that school counselor gets a day break and they get to learn about a college or an institution and they get to travel. It's kind of like a mini field trip. That might be an important piece for them, is just focusing on 1 or 2 high schools rather than like a whole, let's get every rural student to come visit us at once because we'll pay for it. That's a lot trickier. The Rural SIG also does have fly-in guides, so it's available on our website to basically look through those pieces, or our Google Drive. What are like guides and resources for that? So other peers are definitely going through what you're doing. And the final 2 pieces of advice I would have would be, what would it look like for you to not do it during the fall or spring, but instead during the summer? And maybe host a summer camp. And one of the things we had a lot of success with at Purdue is actually our summer college for high school students. So we put on week-long courses where students come. If you can pay for it, that's ideal. They get a free college credit. They get to stay in our residence halls. The family's going to be much more receptive to saying, oh, you get a free college credit and I don't have to feed you for a week. Yeah, go to that college. That's great. That's awesome. Maybe if you can kind of alter what that you're doing to that. The other piece may be hosting an event that those students were going to go to. If these students are passionate about football or DECA or whatever it is, host an event on your campus that sponsors it. We've sponsored multiple events this year. I sponsored the Indiana pitch competition for young entrepreneurs. While they're on our campus, then you can just mysteriously throw in, oh, hey, by the way, if you want to learn about it, here's my contact information. Oh, if you want to go on a tour, we'd be happy to do that. We have students just like you waiting behind, letting them see your football facilities or your baseball facilities if you're hosting a regional or a sectional. These students are going to be traveling regardless for something they're passionate about. And maybe you can just tie in and build a relationship that way. So that would be my pieces of advice. Anybody else want to touch in on buses in?
Just continue to go back to those community relationships. We often will work with them to identify students, and then it's kind of a hand pick. They are working with their students are self-identifying, and it's sort of a win-win. And then we end up paying for all of it, which is great. But the other piece is personal invitations, especially during the yield season, depending on when it is. We send out personal invitations to the students who we're especially targeting and know that might be a barrier. And we say, look, we will provide your transportation. This is how we will get you here. Here are the steps. All we need is you to say yes. And hands down, that has been huge for us, especially during yield season, as we're targeting bringing students to campus who otherwise wouldn't be able to get there.
Yeah, I think for me, I think one of the things that work the most is if you already have, let's say, a group of students, maybe from a local area that you are trying to still increase the pipeline of students from in the rural community. I think honestly a good win would be just to bring the parents out there. I would say, hey, you know what? Instead of the kids, let's bring the parents. Hey, parents, we want to bring you to campus. You don't have to get a permission slip for them. It knocks out a lot of legality stuff, but most importantly, they're the ones who essentially are making that decision. So, hey, let's host a parents event only where the parents can come, and then you have presentations and things for them directly. And I think that may work. So I would hit the parents, community leaders, things like that first, and then, bring in the students maybe for the summer, if you do summer programs or however that may work, for a football game that works. Here in Alabama, it's kind of tough for them to get in front of Nick Saban, but at the end of the day, they still want to see where he parked his car at. And so, you just little things like that, I think may work. But if you actually include the other stakeholders, I think that may go a long way as well. Or target just the schools, like the high schools. The high schools are in that local area, in that community. Bring them in and let them be the ones who go back and talk about how they've had an amazing time, at this institution, and then let them do most of the conversation or, encouraging for you on that back end, and just do it consistently.
Perfect. All right, I want to make sure we have enough time. So Q&A, we already covered it, right? If you have more questions, all of our emails are right now in the chat. Please feel free to do so. That's why we volunteer to do this stuff. It's not a part of our job. It's literally just something we do as a passion project. So if you have questions about, either Southern, Midwest, or East Coast, or any kind of rural recruitment or recruitment in general, please email us, utilize your resources, because I think Mary, Jay, and I can all agree we're all about that authenticity. If a student would be better served somewhere else, we're happily going to send them your way. So email us with questions that you may have. We did want to just promote really quickly that there's a future SIG Learning Lab, which is making your voice heard, submitting conference proposals. So if you're involved in your local ACAC or whatever it may be, and you want to, present and maybe share some resources that you found valuable, just like maybe find something here today or something we didn't know about that you've been doing well with rural student recruitment, this would be a really great webinar to attend. Dr. Matt Newland's going to go over basically how you can be involved in this process and how you can make the best possible conference proposal. So consider joining that. And then we have our YouTube Learning Labs playlist as well. So if you want to go back and watch this or look at it at a later date or any of our previous work, or send this off to a friend that you think could really utilize it, please do so. So that YouTube playlist will be there. And then finally, just thank you so much for joining us. Just keep in mind, you do not have to be a member of NACAC to be involved with the resources of this SIG. So if you're interested, please join this SIG, sign that QR code. The more people we have, the better. Jay, Mary, and I didn't know each other up until literally 2 weeks ago, and it's been great so far, and hopefully we gave you some kind of information to move forward with. And of course, we have our sources for all of our data and pieces like that. So just super thankful for you all being here. And if you need anything else from us or from the SIG, please don't hesitate to reach out. But I think we might give you 1 minute back of your day. So thank you so much for your time. We truly appreciate it. And if you have any questions, feel free to email us, but take care.